The man in the center of the floor weighed 210 pounds. 6 feet 2. Dark GI. Brown belt. He was working a combination right cross, left hook, rear leg kick, and the sound of it filled the room each time the kick landed on the heavy bag in the corner. The bag was bolted to the ceiling. It moved anyway. Bruce Lee was standing by the far wall with his arms at his sides, watching. He hadn't been in the building for 3 minutes. He hadn't spoken to anyone except Chuck Norris, and that conversation had lasted maybe 30 seconds. Now he was just watching the man with the combination drill, the way you watch something when you're not sure yet what you're looking at. The man ran the combination again. Right cross. Left hook. Rear leg kick. The bag swung. Bruce took 1 step forward. Just 1 step. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't say anything. He took 1 step toward the center of the floor and stopped, and my father, who was standing by the door on the far side of the room, said every person in that gym felt it. Not heard it. Felt it. The way you feel a change in air pressure before weather comes in. The man with the combination kept drilling. Bruce watched him. My father heard this story from a man named Ray Harmon. Ray was in that gym the night it happened. He'd been training under Chuck Norris for about 2 years at that point, working the same combination drills as everyone else, and he was standing close enough to see Bruce Lee's face when Bruce took that step forward. My father met Ray through Danny Inosanto, maybe 4 or 5 years after the night at the gym. They were at a gathering at Danny's place a Friday evening, food on the table, people in and out of the backyard. Ray told the story once. My father said he listened without interrupting, which was not something my father did often. My father told it to me twice. Once in the car, driving somewhere I can't remember. Once at the kitchen table, late at night, with the overhead light on and everything else in the house dark. The details that stayed the same both times are the ones I'm giving you now. Chuck Norris's gym. Los Angeles. Somewhere in the early 1970s. Concrete floor. Mirrored walls on 2 sides. Fluorescent lights overhead, the kind that hum if the room gets quiet enough. A row of heavy bags along the back wall, all of them showing where the leather cracked at the bottom where kicks had landed 10,000 times. A wooden rack near the door with staffs and practice weapons, the wood dark from handling. About 30 students on the floor when Bruce Lee walked in. All of them mid-drill. None of them knew he was coming. My father said Ray told him that Chuck hadn't announced it, hadn't told his students ahead of time, hadn't prepared anyone. Bruce Lee just walked through the door at 7 in the evening on a weeknight, shook Chuck's hand, and stood there looking at the class. Ray remembered the shoes. He said Bruce was wearing leather-soled shoes, not canvas, not rubber-soled training shoes. Dark pants. Plain white t-shirt. He looked like a man who had come from somewhere else and stopped here on the way. Ray said he looked like he was going to the post office. Except for the way he stood. My father asked him what he meant by that. Ray thought about it for a moment. Like the floor was his, Ray said. Not Chuck's. His. My father wrote that down. Chuck Norris in the early 1970s was not yet the man most people know. He was something more specific than that, and in the world he occupied, something more significant. He walked into his own gym the way a man walks into a room he built with his hands. He knew the name of every student on the floor. He knew their rank, their weak combinations, the habits they'd picked up that he was in the process of correcting. He had built this place, not just the physical space, but the system inside it. The curriculum. The standards. The expectation of what a person could become if they worked hard enough and long enough under his instruction. Bruce moved through the room while Chuck watched from the side. He walked between the drilling pairs slowly, hands behind his back, eyes moving from one pair to the next, spending maybe 15 seconds at each station before moving on. His face didn't change. He stopped behind the man with the combination drill. The man's name was Gary. Ray didn't remember his last name or said he never knew it. About 6'2", 210, brown belt, one of the stronger students in the gym. He'd been training under Chuck for 3 years. The combination he was drilling, right cross, left hook, rear leg kick, was one he'd done 10,000 times. His body knew it without asking. Bruce watched him run it twice. Then Bruce said, "Do that last part again." Gary stopped, looked at Chuck. Chuck nodded. Gary ran the combination. Bruce said, "Again." Gary ran it. Bruce said, "Stop there. Right there. Don't finish it." Gary stopped mid-combination, right cross landed, left hook cocked, weight shifted forward for the kick that wasn't coming. He held the position. Bruce walked around him. He was looking at Gary's hip. Ray said Bruce crouched slightly, not to look up at the hip, but to look directly at it, the way a mechanic looks at a part he thinks might be the problem. He was maybe 18 inches away from Gary's body. Close enough that Gary could hear him breathing. Bruce stood back up. He said, "Your weight moves before your hand does." Gary said, "That's how I was taught." Bruce looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "I know." The room went quiet. Not the quiet of a confrontation. Not the quiet of offense or insult. The quiet of a room full of people who have just heard something true that they didn't have words for yet. Ray said he felt the hair stand up on his arms. He said he looked around the room and saw the same thing on every face, not anger, not pride, not defensiveness. Something slower and more uncomfortable than any of those. Recognition. Every student on that floor had been taught the same combination. Every student on that floor had the same weight shift. Every student on that floor had just had the ceiling named. Chuck Norris was standing 6 feet from Bruce. Ray watched Chuck's face. My father asked him what Chuck's face looked like. Ray said, like a man who just heard his own name said wrong. Not angry about it. Just recalculating. Chuck said, "Show them." Bruce turned to face the class. Bruce stood in the center of the floor. 30 people on the walls. He didn't perform readiness. He wasn't in a fighting stance, wasn't telegraphing anything, wasn't doing what a man does when he wants a room to know he could destroy it. He was just standing. Weight even, feet at shoulder width, hands at his sides, the same way he'd been standing since he walked through the door. He looked at the class. He said, "I'm going to show you something. Then I want each of you to try it. Then I'm going to tell you what I see." He paused. He said, "This is going to be uncomfortable." Uncomfortable means the ceiling just got higher. Ray said 40 people exhaled at once. Then Bruce moved. My father described what happened next the way Ray described it to him, which is to say, imperfectly, with gaps, with the particular honesty of a man trying to reconstruct something his body remembered better than his words did. Ray had been a serious student for 2 years. He'd seen a lot of martial artists work. He had a trained eye for technique, for weight distribution, for the tells that come before a strike lands. He said watching Bruce Lee move was like watching a different sport. Not a better version of what they were doing. A different thing entirely. He said, the jab had no telegraph. Most fighters, even the good ones, there's a tell. The shoulder drops a fraction. The weight shifts a fraction. Something moves before the hand does. His hand was just there. Like it had already been there and you'd missed it arriving. Bruce ran the same combination Gary had been drilling. Right cross. Left hook. Rear leg kick. But the weight didn't move before the hand did. The weight stayed back until the moment of contact. Not a tenth of a second before. Not a half second before. At the moment of contact, the weight transferred, the force went through the target. And then the weight came back. Loaded. Transferred. Retrieved. Ray said, "It sounds simple when you say it." It wasn't simple. The kick was different. Ray struggled to explain this part to my father. My father said he tried 3 different descriptions before landing on one that made sense. Here's what Ray finally said. When you watch most kicks, even good kicks, competition-level kicks, you can read the sequence. The weight loads, the hip turns, the leg comes up. Cause and effect. You can track it. You can see where it's going before it gets there. His kick had no sequence. It was just the kick existed. Like he'd removed all the steps that happened before a kick and kept only the part where the kick is real. The bag moved on the last kick. It was a heavy bag. Bolted to the ceiling. It moved. Bruce stepped back. He looked at Gary. "Try it," he said. Gary reset. Took a breath. Stood in his starting position with the combination loaded in his body the way it had been loaded for 3 years of daily drilling. He ran it. Right cross. Left hook. Rear leg kick. His weight moved before his hand did. It had always moved before his hand did. His body had been trained to move that way. The information was in the muscle, not the mind, and the muscle didn't care what Bruce Lee had just demonstrated. The muscle did what it knew. Gary felt it. My father said Ray told him Gary's face changed the moment it happened, mid-combination, weight shifting early, and Gary's face going through something in real time. Not embarrassment. Not frustration. Something more specific. The recognition that the body doesn't change just because the mind has been shown something new. Gary stopped. He said, again. He meant himself. He wasn't asking Bruce. He was giving himself the instruction. He ran it again. Same result. He ran it a 3rd time. Same result. He stood there for a moment looking at the bag. Then he said, and my father wrote this down verbatim because he said it was the most honest thing he'd heard anyone say in a gym in 15 years of being around martial artists. "I've been doing that wrong for 6 years." Bruce said, "You've been doing it right. For what you were taught." He looked at Gary. "What you were taught has a ceiling." Nobody moved. Ray said the room had the quality of air before a storm. Not the storm itself. The pressure change that tells you it's coming. Every person on that floor had been taught by Chuck Norris or by someone Chuck had trained. Every person on that floor had drilled that combination. Every person on that floor had a weight shift that moved before their hand did. And a man in leather shoes and a plain white t-shirt had just put a name on the ceiling. Chuck said, "Show them the correction." Bruce turned back to Gary. "Run it again," he said. "Slower." Gary ran it slower. Bruce moved alongside him this time. Not to demonstrate the correction in isolation, to shadow the combination at Gary's pace, doing it wrong first, exaggerating the early weight shift so Gary could see from the outside what his own body was doing. He said, "Watch the hip." Gary watched. Then Bruce ran it clean. Same combination, same pace. The weight didn't move until the hand did. The kick came from a different place entirely, not from weight already falling forward, but from weight still loaded back, released at the last possible moment, arriving through the target instead of stopping at its surface. Ray said, "The sound was the thing." My father asked him what he meant. Ray said, "The bag." I've heard bags get hit for years. This was different. Like the difference between dropping a book and throwing it. Same object. Different place it comes from. Gary uncocked his left hook. Let his hands drop. He stood there for a moment. Then he said, "Do it one more time." Bruce did it one more time. Gary said, "One more." Bruce did it again. Gary stood there. He didn't try to run it again himself. Not yet. He just stood there with his hands at his sides, looking at the bag, and Ray said the look on his face was the look of a man trying to hold something new in his body before it slips away. Chuck was watching Gary. Then Chuck looked at Bruce. Bruce was already looking at the rest of the class. He said, "Who's next?" It wasn't a question. The next student was a woman named Karen. Ray remembered her specifically. She'd been training under Chuck for about 18 months. Lightweight, fast, one of the better technical students in the gym, the kind of person who picks up combinations quickly and runs them clean the first time. Ray said she was the student Chuck pointed to when he wanted to demonstrate something to the rest of the class. Bruce looked at her. He said, "Same combination." Karen ran it. Right cross. Left hook. Rear leg kick. Her weight moved before her hand did. She knew it the moment it happened. Ray said her face registered it in real time, not surprise, because she just watched Gary run it 4 times and Bruce run it twice, but something closer to confirmation of a thing she'd suspected without knowing she suspected it. She stopped. Bruce said, "Again." She ran it again. Same result. Bruce said, "Again." 3rd time. Same result. He didn't say anything for a moment. Just watched. Then he said, "You're fighting the combination." Karen looked at him. He said, "You were taught a sequence. Cross, hook, kick. Your body treats them as 3 separate things. They're not 3 separate things. They're one thing that happens to have 3 moments in it. The weight moves early because your body is preparing for the next moment instead of being in this one." Karen said, "How do I fix it?" Bruce said, "You don't fix it. You rebuild it." He looked at the class. "All of you," he said. "You don't fix it. You rebuild it." Ray said the room went quiet again. A different kind of quiet this time. Not the quiet of recognition. The quiet of something large being placed on the table that everyone is going to have to carry. 3 years of drilling. 18 months of drilling. 6 years of drilling. All of it built on a weight shift that moved before the hand did. Chuck Norris was standing at the edge of the floor. He hadn't moved from that position since he'd said show them. Ray said he watched Chuck the way you watch a man whose house you're standing in when a stranger starts rearranging the furniture, not hostile, not welcoming, something suspended between the two. Bruce turned back to Karen. Try it again, he said. But this time don't think about the cross. Don't think about the hook. Don't think about the kick. Think about contact. The moment of contact. Let everything else serve that moment. Karen stood there. She took a breath. She ran the combination. The weight didn't move early. Not perfectly. Not even close to what Bruce had demonstrated. But it didn't move early. It held for a fraction of a second longer than it had in her previous 3 attempts, and the kick that came out of that fraction of a second had a different quality than the kicks before it. Ray said the sound was different. Not dramatically. Not the way Bruce's kick had sounded different. But different enough that Karen heard it and stopped and looked at her own foot the way you look at a part of your body that has just done something new. She looked at Bruce. He said that. Just that one word. Karen nodded. Ray said she looked like a woman who had just been handed something she was going to spend the next 3 years learning how to hold. Bruce moved to the next student. Then the next. Then the next. Ray said he worked through maybe 12 students in the first 40 minutes. Not every student, he didn't run every person in the room through the correction individually. He seemed to pick based on something Ray couldn't identify. Not rank. Not size. Not how long they'd been training. Something else. My father asked Ray what he thought the selection criteria was. Ray thought about it. He said, I think he picked the ones who were already close. The ones whose bodies were almost doing it right and just needed one thing moved. My father said, like a mechanic looking for the part that's almost working. Ray said, exactly like that. The 4th student Bruce called was a man named Davis. Bigger than Gary. 6'3", maybe 220. He'd been training under Chuck for 4 years, which made him one of the senior students in the room. He had the combination locked in his body the way you lock in a car route you've driven 1,000 times, not conscious, not deliberate, just there when you need it. He ran it. Weight moved early. Bruce watched. He said, again. Davis ran it. He said, again. Davis ran it a 3rd time. Then a 4th. Then a 5th, without Bruce asking. Ray said Davis was a man who worked through problems by repetition. If something wasn't right, he ran it again. And again. And again, until his body found the correction on its own. It was how he'd gotten good. It was how he'd built everything he had. He ran it a 6th time. Still early. A 7th. Still early. He stopped. He looked at Bruce. He said, I can't feel where it's wrong. Bruce looked at him for a moment. Then he did something Ray said he'd never seen a teacher do. He turned Davis around so Davis had his back to the class and was facing the mirrored wall. Then Bruce stood directly behind him, close, and he put one hand on Davis's hip. Not gripping. Just resting there. One hand on the right hip, light as a hand on a door that you're about to push open. He said, run it. Davis ran the combination. The moment the weight shifted early, the fraction of a second before the cross landed when the hip began to move, Bruce's hand pressed. Not hard. A signal. A tap. Davis felt it. He stopped. He said, there. Bruce said, "There." Davis ran it again. The tap came again. Davis stopped again. Bruce said, "Don't stop. Keep going. Feel it and keep going." Davis ran it again. Tap. He kept going. The cross landed. The hook came. The kick came. All of it a fraction of a second slower than it had been, because Davis was now monitoring something in his body he'd never monitored before, and monitoring takes time you don't have in a real situation. Bruce said, "Too slow." Davis said, "I know." Bruce said, "That's fine. Right now slow is right. Fast comes later. Fast without the feel is just fast wrong." Ray said that sentence landed in the room like a stone in a pond. He said he heard at least 2 people near him repeat it under their breath. Fast without the feel is just fast wrong. Davis ran the combination again. Slower than his natural pace. Monitoring the hip. Weight held back a fraction longer than it wanted to go. The kick arriving a different way. Bruce took his hand off Davis's hip. He watched. Davis ran it again. Same pace. Same monitoring. Then again. And on the 5th repetition something shifted. Ray said it wasn't dramatic. He said it didn't look like a revelation. It looked like a man finding a key in a coat pocket he'd forgotten about. Just there. Without ceremony. The weight held. The cross landed. The hook came. The kick left from a loaded position and arrived through the bag instead of at it. The bag moved. Not the way it moved when Bruce kicked it, but differently than it had moved when Davis kicked it before. Davis stopped. He stood there looking at the bag. He didn't say anything. Bruce moved to the next student. The room had changed by now. Ray said it was hard to describe exactly what changed, but that everyone in the room felt it. The students who hadn't been called yet were running their combinations differently, slower, more monitored, aware of something in their own bodies they hadn't been aware of 40 minutes ago. The students who had been called were working in the corner, trying to hold what they'd found. The sound of the room was different. Fewer hard impacts. More careful strikes. The quality of attention on the floor had shifted from drilling to searching. Chuck Norris was still at the edge of the floor. Still hadn't moved. Ray said he looked at Chuck's face 3 separate times during those 40 minutes. Each time, Chuck's expression was the same. Not angry. Not defensive. Not performing openness or performing discomfort. Just watching. Ray said Chuck was the most honest man in the room that night. Because he didn't pretend it wasn't happening. He just stood there and let it happen and watched every single thing. My father asked Ray what he thought Chuck was thinking. Ray was quiet for a moment. He said, "I think he was doing math." My father asked what kind of math. Ray said, "The kind where you find out your foundation has a number on it." My father wrote that down too. Bruce had been working the floor for maybe 45 minutes when he stopped. He was standing near the center of the room. 12 students had worked with him directly. The other 18 or so had been working on their own, trying to apply what they'd watched. The room was still going, the drills hadn't stopped, the class had never been formally suspended, but the energy in it had changed completely. Bruce looked at the class. He said, "Take a break." Students moved to the walls. Water. Breath. Quiet conversation. Bruce walked to Chuck. They stood together at the edge of the floor. Ray was close enough to hear some of it. Not all of it, they weren't speaking loudly, and the room still had enough ambient noise to cover most of what they said. But Ray heard one exchange clearly. Chuck said, "How long to rebuild it?" Bruce said, "Depends on how long they've been building it wrong." Chuck said, "Some of them have 4 years in it." Bruce said, "Then it takes longer than 4 years to trust the new version. But less time than that to start feeling the difference." Chuck looked at the floor. He said, "I taught them that way." Bruce said, "I know." Chuck said, "Is that what you've been seeing? Every time we've sparred?" Ray said Bruce didn't answer that immediately. He said there was a long enough silence that Ray thought maybe Bruce wasn't going to answer at all. Then Bruce said, "The third round. Every time. You load the kick early. I've been reading it for 3 years." Ray said Chuck Norris nodded. "Just once. A man receiving information he'd asked for." Ray said it was the most remarkable thing he saw that night. Not the demonstration. Not the correction spreading through the room. The moment a 6-time world karate champion heard that a man had been reading his body for 3 years and simply nodded. No argument. No defense. Just received. Chuck said, "Show me." The class moved back from the center. Not because anyone told them to. Ray said it happened the way things happen when a room understands something without being instructed, a collective reading of the situation, 30 people simultaneously registering that the center of the floor was about to be needed for something different. They moved to the walls. Chuck and Bruce stood facing each other in the center of the room. Ray said the overhead lights were humming. He could hear them now because the room had gone quiet enough. Fluorescent lights in a concrete-floored gym, a specific kind of hum, thin and constant, the kind of sound that only exists when everything else stops. Chuck settled into his stance. 6-time world champion. Undefeated in open competition for a decade. The man who had built this floor, trained these students, developed the system that every person in this room had spent months or years internalizing. He stood in the stance his body had lived in for 15 years. Bruce stood across from him. Plain white t-shirt. Leather shoes. Hands at his sides. Ray said he didn't breathe for the first 30 seconds. Chuck moved first. Not a full combination. A jab, single, sharp, testing. The kind of strike a man throws to measure distance and read response. Bruce wasn't there. Not dodged. Ray said it wasn't a dramatic movement, wasn't a lean or a duck, wasn't a technique performed. Bruce simply wasn't in the place the jab expected him to be. A fraction of movement, a fraction of a second before the jab arrived, and the space the jab traveled through was empty. Chuck reset. He threw the jab again. Same result. Ray said, it wasn't like watching someone dodge a punch. It was like watching someone not be where a punch is. Those are different things. My father asked him to explain the difference. Ray said, dodging is reactive. You see the punch and you move away from it. What Bruce did wasn't reactive. It was like he moved before the punch existed. Like he was responding to something that hadn't happened yet. My father said. Taiki Kimura described it the same way. Ray said, then Taiki saw it too. Chuck threw a cross. Bruce's left hand came up open palm, not a block, a redirect, and the cross went past him to the left while his right hand arrived at Chuck's ribs. Stopped 1 inch out. Chuck felt the air of it. He reset. He tried the cross again, this time with a feint first, a shoulder drop meant to trigger Bruce's redirect early, to set up the real strike on the other side. Bruce didn't take the feint. The real cross came. Same result. Different hand. Same inch of space between the strike and contact. Ray said Chuck made a sound. Not a word. A sound, the sound a man makes when his body has been read accurately and he knows it and his body knows it and his body is angry in the specific way a trained body gets angry when it's been anticipated. Not rage. Not embarrassment. The anger of a precision instrument being told it has a tell. Chuck adjusted his stance. He moved his weight differently. Shifted his back foot. Changed the angle of his shoulders. 3 years of sparring with Bruce Lee had given him a read on Bruce's counters, and Chuck was methodical, analytical, a man who processed information and applied it. He had data. He had 12 years of competition experience. He had a body that had been pressure tested against the best fighters on the American martial arts circuit. He reset and came forward. This time he didn't lead with the jab. He went straight to the combination, cross, hook, the kick loading behind it. And the kick telegraphed. 1 fraction of a second. 1 fraction of a second where Chuck's hip began its rotation before his hook had fully extended, where the weight began its transfer before the combination was complete. Bruce had said it 40 minutes ago over Gary's body. Your weight moves before your hand does. And now, in the center of his own floor, in front of his own students, Chuck Norris did the thing Bruce Lee had been reading for 3 years. The hip moved early. Bruce read it. He stepped inside the kick's arc, not away from it, into it, to the distance where the kick had no leverage, and his right hand came up to Chuck's chest. Stopped. Flat palm. 1 inch out. The strike that would have been there. Nobody moved. Ray said the room had stopped breathing. Chuck looked down at Bruce's hand. Then he looked at Bruce's face. Bruce lowered his hand. He said, the 3rd round. Every time. Chuck stood there. He didn't say anything for a long moment. The fluorescent lights hummed. Ray said Chuck took 1 breath that was audible across the room. Slow. Controlled. The breath of a man processing. Then Chuck said, again. They went again. My father asked Ray how many times they sparred that night, and Ray said he thought it was 6 or 7 rounds, but it might have been more. Time had done something strange in the room by then. The quality of attention was so high that Ray couldn't track it the way he normally tracked time. It compressed and expanded in the wrong places. What he could tell my father with certainty was the shape of what happened across those rounds. In the first 2 rounds, Chuck came forward the same way and Bruce read the hip the same way, and the result was the same. In the 3rd round, Chuck slowed down. Deliberately. Dramatically. He reduced his pace to something below his natural speed, moving at maybe 60% of what he was capable of, clearly trying to restructure something from the foundation up while in motion. Ray said it was like watching a man try to rewire his own house while living in it. He was slower. He was more controlled. The hip still moved early. Not as early. But early. Bruce read it. In the 4th round, Chuck tried something different. He stopped leading with power. He threw jabs only, no crosses, no hooks, no kicks. Just jabs, one after another, testing distances, reading Bruce's reads, building information about how Bruce was tracking him. Bruce let 2 of the jabs land. Ray said they weren't hard. Chuck wasn't throwing at power. But Bruce let them land, rolled with them, absorbed them, didn't counter, and Ray said the room didn't understand it at first. My father said he didn't understand it when Ray told him. He said, "Why did Bruce let the jabs land?" Ray said, "I think he was giving Chuck something." My father said, "What do you mean?" Ray said, Chuck had been stripped of his combination. His cross, his hook, his kick. Bruce had named the tell on all of it. His jabs were clean. He didn't have a tell on the jab. And I think Bruce knew that, and I think he let a few land because Chuck needed to know that something still worked. That not everything had been named. My father didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "That's a strange kind of generosity." Ray said, "That's what I thought." It took me about 2 years to understand it. But yeah. Generosity. In the 5th round, Chuck made an adjustment. Ray said you could see it happening, not the adjustment itself, but the moment Chuck decided to make it. He said Chuck stopped moving for 1 second, just standing in his stance, not committed to anything, and his eyes changed. Not his expression. His eyes. The calculation completing. Then he moved. He feinted low with his left hand, not the shoulder drop feint he'd tried before, but a full hand movement, committed, designed to pull Bruce's weight forward. Then he went high with the cross on the right. Bruce took the feint. Partially. His weight shifted a fraction forward and his left hand came up for the redirect and the cross was already past it. Chuck had gone high enough that the redirect missed and the cross landed on Bruce's shoulder. Hard. Ray said it was the first real clean contact of the night. Chuck's cross on Bruce's shoulder, full extension, weight behind it. Bruce moved with it. Rolled the shoulder. Stepped back. He was smiling. Ray said he was smiling. Not performing. Not a combat smile to show he wasn't hurt. Just, he looked pleased. Like Chuck had just done something that interested him. Chuck reset. His breathing had changed. Ray said he'd found something. You could see it. He'd found one thing that worked and his whole body reorganized around it. Bruce said, again. Chuck threw the feint low, the cross high. Bruce didn't take the feint. The cross landed on empty air. Chuck's weight was forward now, committed to the cross, and Bruce's right hand arrived at his ribs. Stopped. 1 inch. Ray said Chuck laughed. Not a bitter laugh. Not an embarrassed laugh. A genuine laugh, short, surprised, the laugh of a man who has just been shown something by a puzzle he thought he'd solved. He said, "You knew." Bruce said, "The second time, yes." Chuck said, "And the first time?" Bruce said, "The first time you surprised me." Chuck nodded. He said, "Good." Just that. Good. Ray said it was the word of a man filing information, not satisfaction, not consolation. Just confirmation that the data point was real. They ran the sequence again. Feint low, cross high. Bruce didn't take the feint. The cross went past Bruce's hand to the ribs. Chuck said, "Change the timing on the feint." He wasn't talking to Bruce. He was talking to himself. He ran it again with a different timing on the feint, slower setup, faster execution, changing the rhythm to disrupt Bruce's read. Bruce read it anyway. Chuck said, "Change the angle." He ran it with the feint coming from a slightly different angle, trying to change the visual signature of the movement. Bruce read it. Chuck stood there. He tried it 4 more times, changing one variable each time: speed, angle, level, the distance from which the feint initiated. All 4 times Bruce read it. On the 5th attempt, Chuck changed 2 variables simultaneously. Bruce read it and almost missed the counter. His hand arrived at Chuck's ribs a fraction of a second later than the previous counters, and not 1 inch out but touching, the flat of his palm making contact. Chuck felt it. He stopped. He looked at Bruce. He said, "That one was close." Bruce said, "That one was good." Ray said that exchange lasted maybe 4 seconds. 2 sentences. And he said it was the most compressed piece of information he'd ever watched pass between 2 people in a gym. Because what Chuck heard in "that one was good" was not a compliment. It was a grade. It was Bruce Lee telling Chuck Norris that one specific variation of one specific combination had reached a level that qualified as good. Not great. Not there yet. Good. And Ray said Chuck heard the whole thing. The compliment and the limitation and the compliment and the distance between good and whatever came after good. He heard all of it in 2 words. And he nodded. And he ran the variation again. They went 2 more rounds. By the end of the 7th round, something had changed in how Chuck was moving. Not dramatically. Not visibly enough that everyone in the room would have caught it. But Ray was watching closely enough to see it, and my father, when Ray described it, said it matched something Taiki Kimura had told him about watching Bruce work with students. The hip was loading later. Still early. Still not where Bruce was. But later than it had been at the start of the evening. A fraction of a second later. A fraction that a trained eye could see and an untrained eye would miss. 3 years of pattern. Moving. Ray said, not fixed. Not corrected. Just started. My father asked him what he meant. Ray said, something had started in Chuck's body that he was going to spend the next 3 years working on. You could see the start of it. Just the start. Like the first crack in a piece of wood before it splits. You can't see what it's going to become. You can only see that it's begun. The 7th round ended. Bruce stepped back. He looked at Chuck. He said, "The 3rd round." Chuck said, "I know." Bruce said, "Work the feint. The double variable version. That's the one." Chuck said, "I know." Ray said they stood there for a moment. 2 men at the center of a floor that 30 people were watching from the walls. The fluorescent lights humming. Then Chuck turned to his class. He said, "Back to work." The students moved off the walls. The drills resumed. But Ray said the sound of the room was different from that point forward. The combinations people were running were slower. More careful. People were monitoring things in their bodies they'd never monitored before. And at the edge of the floor, Chuck Norris ran the feint cross combination by himself. Low feint, high cross, double variable. Alone at the wall. Running it again. And again. And again. Like a man who has just been told exactly what he needs to fix and has already started. The drills ran for another hour. Bruce stayed on the floor the whole time. He didn't run a formal class. He didn't stand at the front and instruct. He moved through the room the same way he'd moved through it at the beginning of the evening, slowly, hands behind his back, stopping behind a student for 15 or 20 seconds, watching, then moving on. But the room was different now. The students weren't just drilling. They were watching themselves drill. The difference sounds small. It isn't small. Ray said it was the difference between a man driving a road he knows and a man driving the same road for the first time, same road, same car, same hands on the wheel, but every sensation arriving new. People were feeling their own weight shifts. Feeling the early load. Feeling the moment the hip wanted to go before the hand was ready. Feeling the ingrained pattern pushing back against the new information. Ray said it was uncomfortable in the specific way that real learning is uncomfortable, not painful, not discouraging, but the particular discomfort of a body being asked to unlearn something it spent years building. Like being asked to write your name with your non-dominant hand. You know what a signature looks like. Your hand doesn't. Bruce stopped behind a student in the far corner. A young man, maybe 20, who'd been training for about 8 months. His combination was rougher than the senior students, more gaps, less economy, the kind of technique that still has a lot of air in it before compression sets in. He ran the combination and his weight moved early and he felt it and stopped and looked at his own hip the way Davis had looked at his hip earlier in the evening. Bruce watched him. He didn't say anything. The student ran it again. Same result. He stopped again. Bruce said, "Don't stop." The student looked at him. Bruce said, "Don't stop when you feel it. Feel it and keep going. Right now you stop because the feeling is new and new feelings feel like errors. They're not errors. They're information. Keep going." The student ran it. He felt the early shift. He kept going. The combination finished. Bruce said, "Again." He ran it again. Felt it. Kept going. Again. Felt it. Kept going. After the 5th repetition, Bruce said, "Less." The student looked at him. Bruce said, "The feeling is getting louder because you're listening for it. It should get quieter. Let it get quieter. Trust that it's still there even when you can't hear it." The student ran it again. Ray watched from across the room. He said, "I don't know if it worked right then. I don't know if that kid fixed his weight shift that night. But I know his face changed. It went from the face of a person trying to correct an error to the face of a person trying to learn a language. Those are different faces." My father asked Ray at what point during the evening he started to understand what Bruce was actually doing. Not the technique correction. The larger thing. Ray thought about it. He said it was sometime during that second hour, watching Bruce move through the room, that he started to see the shape of it. He said, most teachers, when they find an error, they want to fix the error. They want the student to do the right thing as fast as possible. Get past the mistake, get to the correct version, move on. Bruce wasn't fixing errors. He was installing a sense. A sense for something these people had never been able to feel in their own bodies before. And he knew that you can't install a sense in an hour. You can only open the channel. My father said, "Open the channel." Ray said, "Show the body that the thing exists." That's all you can do in one session. Show the body that the thing exists and let the body spend the next 3 years learning how to find it reliably. My father said that matched something Bruce had told Danny Inosanto once, in a different context. Danny had described it differently. He'd said something about turning on a light in a room so you can see what's there, not so you can rearrange it. The rearranging takes longer. But you can't rearrange what you can't see. Ray said, "That's exactly it. That's exactly what he was doing. Around the 90-minute mark, Bruce stopped moving through the room. He walked back to the center of the floor and stood there. The same position he'd stood in at the beginning, weight even, feet at shoulder width, hands at his sides. He didn't say anything. The room gradually noticed and gradually stopped. 30 people at the walls or in clusters, drills fading out, everyone turning toward the center of the floor. Bruce looked at the class. He said, "What Chuck has is real." Ray said nobody expected that. The room had been in the middle of a correction session. For 90 minutes, the implicit message of everything that had happened was that Chuck's system had a flaw, that the foundation was wrong, that 3 years and 4 years and 6 years of drilling had been building toward a ceiling. And now Bruce Lee was standing in the center of the floor saying the opposite. Ray said, "Some people looked confused. Some people looked relieved. I looked at Chuck. My father asked what Chuck's face looked like." Ray said, "Like a man who just heard his name said correctly after hearing it said wrong all evening." Bruce said, "The combination is real. The power is real. The speed is real. What Chuck built here works. You can take it into a real situation and it works. I've seen it work. I've felt it work." He paused. He said, "The weight shift is a ceiling. Not a flaw. A ceiling. There's a difference." Ray said, "I wrote that down afterward. I couldn't remember the exact words, so I wrote down what I remembered. A flaw is something wrong. A ceiling is something right that has a limit." That's what he said. Or something close to it. Bruce looked at the class. He said, "What you've built is good. What I showed you tonight is the next floor up. You can't get to the next floor until you've built this one. You've built this one. That matters." He said, "Chuck built it. You were right to learn from him." The room was very quiet. Ray said Chuck didn't react visibly. He was standing at the edge of the floor with his arms crossed and his face was still in the expression it had held for most of the evening, watchful, calibrating, receiving, and he didn't nod or respond or change. But Ray said his shoulders changed. Something in his shoulders. Like a weight that had been there for 90 minutes just redistributed. Not gone. Just sitting differently. My father said, "What do you think the weight was?" Ray said, "I think it was the question of whether what he'd built was worth anything. Whether the correction meant it was all wrong." And Bruce answered that question directly. In front of his students. In public. My father was quiet. Ray said that was the real move. Not the hip correction. Not the sparring. What he did at the end. That was the real move. Bruce stayed for another 20 minutes. He watched a few more students. Made 1 or 2 individual corrections. Talked briefly with 2 of the senior students near the weapon rack. Then he walked to Chuck. They talked for maybe 5 minutes, privately, at the edge of the floor. Ray couldn't hear this conversation. Nobody could. Then Bruce shook Chuck's hand and walked to the door. He stopped at the door. He turned back to the room. He said, "The third round. Work the third round." He was talking to Chuck. But he was saying it in a room with 30 people in it. Then he left. Ray said the door closed and the room was quiet for maybe 10 seconds. Just the hum of the fluorescent lights and 30 people standing at the walls. Then Chuck said, "Back to work." And the drills resumed. Ray trained in that gym for another 8 months after that night. He said the room was different after Bruce left. Not dramatically. Not in a way that a visitor would have noticed. But different in the specific way a room is different when the people inside it have been given a new lens. The combinations ran slower for the first few weeks. More monitored. More careful. By the end of the first month, they were running at full speed again. But the weight shifts were later. Not Bruce's version. Ray said nobody in that gym achieved what Bruce had demonstrated in the time he was there. But later than they'd been before the evening. Measurably, observably later. The ceiling had moved. Ray said, I don't know what it did for them in competition. I don't know if it made them win more or lose less or fight differently in ways that mattered. I know it changed something in the room. I know Chuck worked that feint combination for 3 months. I know the students who were there that night talked about it for years. My father asked Ray one more thing. He said, Did Chuck ever say anything to you directly about that night? After? Did he ever talk about it? Ray thought about it. He said, once. About a year later. We were working a bag and I said something, I don't remember what, something about weight and timing, and Chuck stopped and looked at me and said, Bruce showed us that. Not me. Us. And then he went back to the bag. My father said, That's everything, isn't it? Ray said, That's everything. My father told me this story twice. The first time was in the car. I was maybe 16. We were driving somewhere, I think it was a hardware store run, something my father did on Saturday mornings when the week was done and he didn't have anywhere specific to be. He liked hardware stores the way some men like libraries. The physical inventory of them. The specificity of every object having a function. We were on the highway and he turned down the radio. He did that when he was going to say something he wanted me to hear clearly, and he said, Ray Harmon told me something about Bruce Lee once. I said, okay. He said, do you want to hear it? I said, yeah. He told it. The whole thing. The gym, the combination, Gary and Karen and Davis, the sparring with Chuck, the weight shift, the feint, the final statement about what Chuck had built. We were in the hardware store parking lot by the time he finished. He'd been talking for maybe 25 minutes. He turned off the engine and sat there for a moment. I said, what's the third round? He looked at me. I said, at the end. Bruce said the third round to Chuck. What did he mean? My father said, Ray thought it meant the third round of their sparring matches. Every time they sparred over 3 years, dozens of sessions, the hip loaded early in the third round. Chuck was tired enough by the third round that his discipline slipped and the habit came back and Bruce could read it. I said, so it was specific. Not general. He'd been tracking Chuck's third round specifically. My father said, that's what Ray thought. I said, for 3 years. My father said, for 3 years. We sat in the parking lot for a moment. I said, did he ever tell Chuck? Before that night? My father looked at me again. He said, Ray didn't know. I don't know. I don't think anyone knows. I said, why do you think he told him that night? My father was quiet for a long time. He said, I think Chuck was ready to hear it. I said, how did Bruce know? My father said, I don't know. Maybe he'd been watching for when Chuck was ready. Maybe that's why he came to the gym that night, not to teach the students, but because Chuck was finally ready. I said, That's a long time to wait. My father said, 3 years. He got out of the car and we went into the hardware store and he bought a box of number 8 screws and a replacement for a faucet washer that had been dripping for a month. We didn't talk about Bruce Lee for the rest of that day. The second time he told it was at the kitchen table. I was older, mid-20s, back home for a few days, one of those visits where you stay longer than planned because something in the house pulls you and you don't have a name for what it is. My mother was asleep. My father was at the table with a cup of tea he'd stopped drinking, just holding it, and I came down for water and sat across from him. He said, "Do you remember Ray Harmon's story?" I said, "The gym. The weight shift." He said, "Yes." He told it again. The same story. The same details in the same order. Gary running the combination. Karen hearing you're fighting the combination. Davis at the mirror with Bruce's hand on his hip. The sparring with Chuck. The feint. The shoulder contact. The final statement. He got to the same place he'd always gotten to, the door closing, the fluorescent lights humming, Chuck saying back to work, and then he stopped. He held his cup of tea. He said, "I thought about that story for 30 years. I said, "What did you think about?" He said, "The third round." I waited. He said, 3 years. Every time they sparred. Bruce reading that hip in the third round every single time. Not telling him. Just knowing it. Carrying it. Waiting. He looked at his tea. He said, "Ray thought he waited because Chuck wasn't ready." I thought that too, for a long time. I said, "What do you think now?" My father said, "I think he waited because the knowing was useful. As long as he hadn't named it, it was there every time they sparred. A thing he could read. A thing that told him where Chuck was going before Chuck went there. The moment he named it, it started to disappear. Chuck would work on it. The hip would get later. The read would get harder." He paused. He said he gave Chuck his own ceiling. He told him where it was. And once he told him, his own advantage started shrinking. I said, "So why did he do it?" My father put down his cup. He said, "Because Chuck asked." He literally asked Bruce to show him. And Bruce couldn't say no to that. Not to that kind of question. Not from that kind of man. He looked at me. He said, "That's what Ray got wrong." He thought the generosity was in the end the statement that Chuck had built something real. But I think the generosity was in the decision to answer the question honestly. To give away the thing you've had for 3 years because someone finally asked the right question. I didn't say anything. My father said, "You know what the hardest thing to give another person is?" I said, "What?" He said, "Something that costs you something. Not money. Not time. Something that changes the situation the moment you give it. Something you can't take back." He picked up his tea again. He said, "Bruce gave Chuck the third round." We sat at the kitchen table for a while after that. The house was quiet. The refrigerator cycled on and off. My father drank his cold tea and I drank my water, and neither of us said anything for a long time, and it was the particular comfortable silence that only exists between people who have been talking about something real. Eventually my father got up and rinsed his cup and said goodnight and went to bed. I sat at the table for another hour. Thinking about a man in leather shoes and a plain white t-shirt, standing in a doorway, turning back to say one thing. The third round. Work the third round. My father died 4 years after that kitchen table conversation. He left behind a series of notebooks, small ones, the kind with black covers and lined pages that you find in office supply stores. He'd been keeping them for decades. Observations. Things people had told him. Quotes he'd heard and wanted to hold on to. I found Ray Harmon's name in one of them. It was in a notebook from the late 1980s, which would have been around when they met at Danny Inosanto's place. The entry was 3 lines. Ray Harmon, Norris Gym, early 70s. Fast without the feel is just fast wrong. The third round. That was all. 3 lines. He'd been carrying it for 30 years, and when he finally wrote it down, it was 3 lines in a black notebook that sat in a box in his closet for 15 more years before I found it. I read those 3 lines standing in his closet with the box on the shelf and the smell of old paper and the specific quality of afternoon light that comes through a small window when the day is ending. Fast without the feel is just fast wrong. The third round. I stood there for a long time. There's something I want to say about Chuck Norris before I go any further. Not because it changes the story. It doesn't change the story. But because I think about it sometimes when I tell this story, and I think it belongs here, in this chapter, before we go back to the gym. Chuck Norris in the early 1970s had nothing to prove. 6 world championships. Undefeated. A gym full of students who trusted him. A system he'd built with 15 years of work. He was, by any measure that existed in the world he occupied, at the top. And he had a man come into his gym and spend 90 minutes identifying a ceiling in his foundation and a tell in his third round, in front of 30 of his students, and he said one word. Again. Not, I built this myself and it works. Not, you're teaching something I don't teach here. Not, this is my gym and my system and my students. Again. Ray said the most remarkable thing he saw that night was the nod. The single nod after Bruce told him he'd been reading the third round for 3 years. A man receiving information he asked for. My father said the remarkable thing was the question itself. Show me. 2 words. A 6-time world champion asking a man in leather shoes to show him where his ceiling was. I think they're both right. I think the nod and the question are the same thing at different moments in the same decision. The decision to be the kind of person who, when standing at the top of what you've built, is still capable of asking what comes next. And meaning it. And listening when the answer arrives. My father didn't talk about Chuck Norris much. He talked about Bruce Lee constantly in the way people talk about something they're trying to understand, returning to it from different angles over years, because the thing keeps revealing new surfaces. But when he talked about that night at the gym, he always talked about Chuck with a specific quality of respect that was different from the way he talked about anyone else. He said once, not in the car, not at the kitchen table, some other time I can't place, he said. Most people, when someone names their ceiling, they get smaller. Chuck got curious. I wrote that down. There is a specific problem with learning from Bruce Lee. Bruce walked back to the center of the floor after his conversation with Chuck at the edge of the room. The students had been drilling for 10 minutes on their own, slower, more monitored, the weight shifts being tracked internally by 30 people who had never tracked them before. He stood in the center. He looked at the class. He said, "Who wants to try the feint?" Not a question. The inflection was flat. A statement with a question mark at the end that was really an invitation, and everyone in the room understood that accepting the invitation was going to cost something. Nobody moved for a moment. Then a student near the back wall raised his hand. Ray said his name was Marcus. Late 20s. About 5'11", 180. He'd been training under Chuck for 2 years and was generally considered one of the more technically advanced students in his cohort, not the most powerful, not the fastest, but the one most likely to be doing the combination correctly. He walked to the center of the floor. Bruce looked at him. He said, "You've been trying to fix the weight shift for the last 10 minutes. Marcus said, "Yes." Bruce said, "How's it going?" Marcus said, "Not well." Bruce said, "Good." Marcus looked at him. Bruce said, "If it were going well after 10 minutes, you'd have found a shortcut." There are no shortcuts in this. The fact that it's not going well means you're working on the right thing. Marcus stood there. Bruce said, "Run the combination." Marcus ran it. Weight moved early. The same fraction of a second early as everyone else in the room. Bruce said, "Again." Marcus ran it. Same result. Bruce said, "Now. Feint low with the left first. Then the cross high. Don't think about the weight. Think about the feint." Marcus reset. He threw the feint, left hand dropping low, a committed movement designed to draw a response, and then the cross high on the right. Bruce stepped inside it. His right hand came to Marcus's ribs. Stopped. He said, "Do you feel what happened?" Marcus said, "You read the feint." Bruce said, "No. I read what came before the feint." Marcus looked at him. Bruce said, "The feint has a tell. The same tell. It comes from the same place your cross has a tell. The hip moves early. But now it moves early for 2 things, the feint and the strike. I have 2 pieces of information instead of 1. Marcus said, "So the feint makes it worse." Bruce said, "The feint as you're throwing it makes it worse. A feint that comes from the same place as your strike, same weight shift, same hip rotation, that feint doesn't work. It confirms what I already know." He paused. He said, "A feint that comes from a different place, that creates a different problem. Chuck found a version of it earlier. He changed 2 variables at once." He looked at Marcus. He said, "What are the variables?" Marcus thought about it. He said, "Speed. Angle." Bruce said, "Speed. Angle. Level. Distance. Timing. Any of those changed alone gives me new information, but not enough to miss. 2 changed simultaneously creates a gap in my read. 3 is almost impossible to track in real time." He paused. He said, "Chuck found 2. That's good. That took him 3 years and a conversation to find." He looked at the class. He said, "You have the conversation now. You didn't have to wait 3 years for it." Ray said he felt the weight of that in the room. The thing Bruce was giving them, not just the technique, but the shortcut through time. The 3 years Chuck had spent building toward that question, compressed into an evening for 30 students who hadn't earned it the same way. Ray said, "I thought about that for a long time. Whether getting the answer without spending the 3 years meant something different. Whether it was the same answer." My father asked him what he decided. Ray said, "I decided it was the same information but a different education." Chuck understood it in his body because his body had been working toward it for 3 years without knowing it. We understood it in our heads. That's not the same thing. Not even close. Bruce worked with Marcus for another 10 minutes. The feint drills were methodical. Bruce would call a variable, change the angle or change the level, and Marcus would adjust one thing and throw the combination. Bruce would read it or not read it, and say which, and why. Ray watched from across the room. He said the thing that struck him most about those 10 minutes wasn't the technique. It was the patience. He said, Bruce Lee was one of the fastest human beings I've ever seen move. Not just in martial arts, in general. The speed of his reactions, the speed of his adjustments, the speed of his processing. Watching him work at the pace of a student who was just beginning to understand something, there was no impatience in it. None. He was moving at Marcus's speed the way a musician moves at the tempo of the song. The speed was the right speed for that moment. My father said he could slow down. Ray said he could do something harder than slow down. He could be genuinely interested at the slow speed. It wasn't patience like waiting. It was attention. Real attention. My father said that matched something Linda Lee had said once in a different context. That Bruce's speed in training wasn't the same as his speed in teaching. That he had different gears and the teaching gear was its own skill, not a diminished version of the fighting gear. Ray said, that's exactly right. The teaching gear was harder, if anything. Because it required him to see what Marcus was seeing instead of what he was seeing. To track someone else's experience of the technique instead of his own. He paused. He said, most fighters can't do that. The best fighters are so inside their own experience of movement that they can't translate it. Bruce could translate it. That was the other gift. After the feint drills, Bruce moved through the room for another 20 minutes. He stopped behind a student here, watched a pair there, said a word or two at one station and nothing at another. Ray lost track of the specific interactions, there were too many and they were happening too quickly and his own drilling was occupying part of his attention. But he remembered one moment from that second pass through the room. Bruce stopped behind a student Ray didn't know well, a younger man, maybe 19, who'd been training for about 6 months. The student was running the combination slowly, very slowly, clearly trying to monitor the weight shift the way Davis had been shown to monitor it. He was going so slowly that the combination barely looked like a combination. It looked like a man walking through a doorway in slow motion, conscious of every part of his body and therefore unable to move any of it naturally. Bruce watched him for a moment. He said, faster. The student looked at him. Bruce said, you're going slow to feel the error. I understand. But at this speed, the error doesn't exist the same way. Speed is part of the pattern. You have to find the error inside the speed, not outside it. The student said, I can't feel it at speed. Bruce said, I know. That's the work. He moved on. The student stood there for a moment. Then he ran the combination at full speed. The weight moved early. He ran it again. The weight moved early. He ran it again. And again. And again. Ray watched him from across the room. He said the student ran that combination maybe 40 times in the next 5 minutes. Fast, full speed, over and over, and every time the weight moved early and every time the student reset and ran it again. Ray said he wasn't finding it. Not that night. But he was doing something else. He was installing the question in his body. Giving his body something to work on while he wasn't thinking about it. While he was sleeping. While he was doing other things. Ray paused. He said, 3 months later I sparred with that kid. His weight didn't move early. My father said, 3 months. Ray said, 3 months of asking the right question. Bruce left the floor around the 2-hour mark. He didn't announce it. He didn't gather the class, didn't give a closing statement, didn't do any of the things a teacher does at the end of a formal session. He walked to Chuck. They talked briefly. Ray couldn't hear this conversation either. But he watched Chuck's face and said Chuck's face was different from the face he'd worn all evening. Ray described it this way. For 2 hours Chuck's face was in a specific mode. Watchful. Absorbing. Measuring. The face of a man doing math. At the end, after they talked, his face changed. It went into a different mode. The math was done. He had the answer. And the answer was workable. Not comfortable, but workable. My father asked what he meant by workable. Ray said he knew what to do. He had a direction. Before that conversation with Bruce, he knew what was wrong, but he wasn't sure it was fixable. After, he knew what to fix and he believed he could fix it. That's workable. Bruce shook Chuck's hand. He walked to the door. He turned back. He said, the 3rd round. Then he left. Ray said the door closed and the room held its silence for a long moment. Chuck stood at the edge of the floor. He looked at his students. He said, the weight shift. He got into his stance. He ran the combination. Right cross. Left hook. Rear leg kick. His weight moved early. He ran it again. Still early. He ran it a 3rd time. Ray said, maybe a fraction later. Maybe. Hard to tell. Chuck looked at the bag. He said to the room, to himself, to no one specific. Work. And everyone went back to drilling. My father had a specific way of storing things he wanted to keep. Not objects. Information. Things people told him that he thought mattered. He didn't trust his memory for the details. He said memory was good at keeping the shape of a thing and bad at keeping the specifics, and for some things the specifics were the whole point. So he wrote them down. 3 lines, 5 lines, rarely more than a paragraph. Enough to anchor the memory to the detail before the detail slipped. The notebooks were his system. He'd been keeping them since his late 20s. By the time he died he had 14 of them, all the same kind, black cover, lined pages, the specific weight of a notebook that fits in a coat pocket. He kept them in a shoebox in his closet, which I always thought was the right container for them. A shoebox is the right size for the things you want to keep but don't know what to do with. I found Ray Harmon's entry in Notebook 7. Late 1980s. The entry before it was about a conversation my father had with a plumber who turned out to have been a boxer in the 1960s. The entry after it was a recipe his mother had given him for something involving rice and a spice I couldn't identify from his handwriting. And in between, Ray Harmon, Norris Gym, early 70s. Fast without the feel is just fast wrong. The 3rd round. 3 lines. I stood in the closet for a long time with Notebook 7 open to that page. We'll come back to that closet. Right now we're back in the gym. The specific problem with learning from Bruce Lee, the thing I started to say at the beginning of this chapter and then put down, is this. Bruce Lee moved through the world at a speed that made most people feel slow. Not because he was trying to make people feel slow. Because the contrast was structural. When you stand next to something moving at a different frequency, you feel the difference in your body before you understand it in your mind. Ray felt it the moment Bruce walked through the door. The students felt it when he took that one step forward. Chuck felt it in the third round of their sparring, every time, for 3 years. And Bruce knew they felt it. He knew the effect his presence had. He knew that his speed and his precision and the quality of his attention created a gap between himself and the people around him that could either inspire or paralyze. Ray said he chose to make it inspire. That was a decision. It wasn't automatic. My father asked how Ray knew it was a decision. Ray said, "Because I've seen people with that kind of ability who didn't make that choice. Who stood at the center of a room and let the gap exist and let people feel small in it. That's not rare." What Bruce did to closing the gap deliberately, moving at the student's speed, being genuinely interested at the slow speed, that was the choice. Every time. All evening. My father wrote that down too. Not in the notebook. In his memory first, the way he stored things he wasn't ready to write yet. And then, years later, in a conversation with me in the car on a Saturday morning, driving to a hardware store. Bruce Lee in the early 1970s was building something. He walked into Chuck's gym that evening, leather shoes, plain white t-shirt, 30 people he'd never taught before, and he spent 2 hours doing something that couldn't be filmed, couldn't be monetized, couldn't be used in a movie or a demonstration or a press release. He spent 2 hours making 30 people better at something they'd been doing wrong for years. And then he left. Ray said he didn't need anything from that room. He had nothing to gain. Chuck was already a friend. The students weren't his students. The technique correction wasn't going to build his reputation. Nobody was going to write about it. Nobody was going to see it except the 30 people on that floor. My father asked, "So why did he do it?" Ray thought about it for a long time. He said, "I think he couldn't not do it." My father said, "Explain that." Ray said, "When you see something wrong, when you can see it clearly, and you know the fix, and you're standing in a room with the people who have the wrong version, there's a cost to not saying anything. Most people don't feel that cost." Bruce felt it. I think the cost of not saying something was higher than the cost of saying it. My father said, even when saying it costs you the 3-year read on Chuck's third round. Ray said, even then. My father was quiet for a moment. He said, "That's a specific kind of generosity. Not the kind that feels good to the giver. The kind that costs the giver something real." Ray said, "Yes." My father said, "And Chuck knew that." Ray said, "I think that's why Chuck nodded the way he nodded. Not just because he received information. Because he understood what the information cost the person giving it." My father said, 2 men in a gym. One gives the other the thing that reduces his own advantage. The other receives it without pretending it's not happening. Ray said, "That's the whole story." My father said, "That's a complete story." Ray said, "Yes." My father met Ray Harmon exactly once. Danny Inosanto's place. A Friday evening in the late 1980s. Food on the table, people in and out of the backyard, the specific quality of a gathering where everyone present has a story about the same person told from a different angle. Ray told the story once. My father listened without interrupting. They didn't exchange phone numbers. My father didn't see Ray again after that evening. But he drove home that night and sat in his car in the driveway for a few minutes before coming inside. My mother asked him what was wrong. He said, "Nothing's wrong. I heard something good." She said, "What did you hear?" He thought about it. He said that the right way to receive something from someone is to understand what it cost them to give it. My mother said, "What does that mean?" My father said, "I'm still working on that." He went inside. He got out notebook 7 and wrote 3 lines. Ray Harmon, Norris Gym, early 70s. Fast without the feel is just fast wrong. The third round. And then he closed the notebook and put it in the shoebox and put the shoebox back on the shelf in the closet. And carried it for 30 years. I think about the weight shifts a lot. Not the martial arts technique specifically. The principle underneath it. The idea that a pattern can be so deeply installed in the body, so many repetitions, so many years of reinforcement that the body does it without asking. And the body does it right. It works. The combination lands. The kick connects. The weight shift serves its function. And somewhere inside that working pattern, invisible because it's inside the working, is the ceiling. The place where the pattern stops being an asset and starts being a limit. And the ceiling is invisible from the inside. You can only see it from the outside. Or from someone who has been watching you long enough to read the tell in the third round. My father spent a lot of his life thinking about this. Not about martial arts. About the thing underneath the martial arts. He worked in the same field for 35 years. He had patterns in his work the way Chuck had patterns in his combinations, deeply installed, functionally effective, built from years of doing the right thing the right way. And somewhere in those patterns, he believed, were ceilings. Places where the ingrained version of right had a limit that he couldn't see from the inside. He said once at the kitchen table, not the night of the Bruce Lee story but a different night, later, he said, "The hardest thing is knowing that you have a third round. That there's a tell somewhere in what you do that someone watching closely enough can read. And you'll never find it yourself. You need someone who's been watching you long enough and cares enough to say something." I said, "Did you ever find yours?" He looked at me. He said, "A few. Not all of them." I said, "How do you know?" He said, "Because I'm still in the third round on some things. I can feel it. I just can't see where the hip moves early." He picked up his tea. He said, "That's the work." 6 months after the night at Chuck's gym, Bruce Lee and Chuck Norris sparred again. This is the part of the story Ray Harmon didn't tell my father directly. My father pieced it together from 2 other sources, a man named Peter Jacobs who trained under Chuck in the mid-70s, and a brief account Danny Inosanto gave him at some point in the early 90s that filled in specific details Peter had left vague. The accounts don't match perfectly. They never do. But the shape of what happened is consistent across both, and the specific moment that my father was most interested in, the third round, is described in almost identical terms by both men. So here is the shape of it. Chuck's gym. 6 months after the evening with the weight shifts and the feint and the 30 students on the floor. It was late afternoon, not evening. Fewer people in the gym, a handful of senior students, maybe 6 or 7, who were working the floor when Bruce arrived. Not a class. Training. Ray wasn't there. Peter Jacobs was. Peter described the same thing Ray had described in the first visit: the shoes, the plain t-shirt, the quality of Bruce's stillness when he walked into a room. The way the room changed without him doing anything specific to change it. Bruce and Chuck shook hands. They talked for a few minutes at the edge of the floor. Peter couldn't hear most of it. He said the conversation had the quality of 2 men continuing something, not starting a new conversation, but picking up a thread from the last one. Comfortable. Direct. No warm-up in it. Then Chuck said, "Let's go." They moved to the center of the floor. Peter said the 6 senior students on the floor stopped drilling without anyone telling them to. They moved to the walls the same way Ray had described, collectively, simultaneously, without instruction. Some rooms just know when to get out of the way. The first round. Peter said it was different from the beginning. He'd heard about the evening 6 months earlier from other students who'd been there. He knew about the weight shift correction, the feint work, the sparring. He was watching with that context. He said the hip was later. Not gone. Not fixed in the way Bruce's was fixed. But later. Measurably, visibly later than it had been described to him by the students who'd been there 6 months ago. Chuck had worked on it. 6 months. Daily. The feint cross combination with the double variable, the weight shift correction, the whole foundation of the system rebuilt from the bottom up while still running the system. Running the car while rewiring the engine. Peter said it looked different. The combination looked more expensive. Like it cost more to produce. Like there was more engine behind it. Bruce read the hip twice in the first round. Not 3 times, not 4 times. Twice. Peter said he counted. He was watching specifically for it. The first time, hip loaded early, Bruce stepped inside the kick, hand to the ribs, stopped an inch out. Standard. The second time, hip loaded, Bruce moved, but the loading was later than the first and Bruce's counter arrived a fraction later too, not late enough to miss, but late enough to notice. Round ended. Chuck reset. He said nothing. Just breathed and reset and waited for the second round. The second round. Bruce came forward this time. This was different from the first visit, where Chuck had initiated most of the action. Peter said Bruce's forward movement had a quality he struggled to describe. He tried 3 different descriptions before landing on one. He said, most people, when they come forward in a fight, there's intention in the movement. You can see they're going somewhere. Bruce's forward movement had no intention in it. He was just closer. Like the distance had changed and he'd simply updated his position accordingly. Chuck dealt with it. He didn't panic, didn't rush his combinations, didn't let the pressure pull him into moving before he was ready. The 6 months of work showed here more than anywhere his stillness under Bruce's forward movement had a different quality than Peter imagined it would have had before the correction session. He threw the feint cross combination. Low feint, high cross, double variable, the combination he'd been working for 6 months. He'd changed the angle and the timing simultaneously, the version that had made Bruce's counter arrive a fraction of a second late the last time. Bruce read it. Counter arrived. Hand to the ribs. 1 inch out. But only just. Peter said it wasn't the clean read. It was a read that almost wasn't a read. Like someone catching something they almost dropped. Chuck reset. He ran the feint cross again with a different variable set, different angle, same timing. Bruce read it but moved differently. Instead of stepping inside he went outside, and his hand came to Chuck's face instead of his ribs. Stopped. 1 inch. Chuck hadn't seen that counter before. Peter said Chuck's face registered it, not surprise, exactly, but the specific recognition of a new piece of information arriving from an expected direction. He'd expected Bruce to have counters. He hadn't mapped that specific counter. He said, new. Bruce said, "Yes." Chuck said, "How long have you had it?" Bruce said, "Tonight." Peter said, "That was the moment for me. Tonight." He'd created a new counter in real time, in the second round, responding to 6 months of Chuck's adjustment. Not something he'd been holding back. Something that existed because of what Chuck had done. Because Chuck had gotten better. My father asked Peter what he thought that meant. Peter said, it meant Bruce wasn't working from a fixed library. He wasn't running plays. He was responding. The better Chuck got, the better the problem Bruce was working on. And better problems make better solutions. He paused. He said, Chuck made Bruce better by getting better himself. My father said, 2 people improving each other by improving. Peter said, spiraling up instead of one catching the other. The third round. Peter said he was watching the hip specifically. He'd been watching it all evening. Round 3 opened with Chuck taking the initiative again. He'd been reactive for most of round 2 and was resetting to his forward game. He came in with the jab, testing distance, reading Bruce's response pattern the same way he'd done in the last session. The jabs were cleaner than before. Not just technically cleaner, Peter said the weight was sitting differently behind them. The loading was later, the transfer was more complete, the jabs were arriving with more of Chuck than had been in them 6 months ago. Bruce took one. Rolled with it. Didn't counter. Same thing as before, letting the clean jab land, confirming that the jab worked, giving Chuck the data point. Or maybe not giving. Maybe the jab was clean enough that taking it was the honest response. Peter wasn't sure which. He said, I think about that sometimes. Whether Bruce let it land or whether it genuinely landed. At the level those two were working, that distinction might not have a clean answer. 3 jabs. 1 landed. Bruce moved from the other 2. Chuck loaded the cross. Peter was watching the hip. The hip loaded late. Later than 6 months ago. Measurably, visibly later. The cross was coming from a deeper load, the transfer was fuller, the strike was arriving with more weight behind it than it had ever had before. And Bruce, for the first time in 3 rounds, moved a fraction of a second later than he'd moved all evening. Not late. Not caught. He wasn't there when the cross arrived, and he countered, and the counter was clean. But Peter said, something happened in his face. My father asked, what happened? Peter said, recalibration. I'd watched him for 2.5 rounds with the same face, completely still, reading, processing. And for one moment in round 3, his face did something. Something new arrived. He had to update. Chuck felt it. Peter said you could see Chuck feel it, the fraction of a second where Bruce's movement was different, where the read was harder, where the tell was quieter. Chuck felt it in the same way a man working at a door feels the moment the resistance changes and the door is about to open. He reset immediately. He loaded the cross again. Hip late again. Bruce moved. Moved, but from a different starting point than he'd used for the first counter. He'd already updated. The recalibration was done in real time, between one cross and the next. Peter said, I'd never seen anything like it. Chuck improved by 6 months of work. Bruce updated in the pause between 2 punches. The round continued. Chuck's hip stayed late, later than it had ever been, late enough that Peter could see it was costing Chuck something to hold it there, that the discipline of the later load was still an imposed discipline and not yet a natural one. Still lived in the mind, not yet lived in the body. but late. Bruce countered off at each time. Later and later each time. By the end of the third round, Bruce's counters were arriving a full half-second after they would have arrived at the beginning of the evening. Not because Bruce was slowing down. Because Chuck had moved the timing enough that Bruce had to move with it. Round ended. They stopped. They stood in the center of the floor. Peter said neither of them spoke for a moment. The 6 senior students on the walls hadn't moved. The gym was quiet. Afternoon light through the high windows, the specific quality of late-day light in a room with concrete floors warm and horizontal, dust in it. Bruce looked at Chuck. He said, "The third round is different." Chuck said, "6 months." Bruce said, "I know." Chuck said, "Is it enough?" Bruce thought about it for a moment. He said, "It's not there yet. But it's in there now. Your body knows it exists." Chuck said, "What does that mean practically?" Bruce said, "It means the next 6 months are faster than the first 6 months. Because you're not learning it from nothing. You're deepening something your body has already found once." Chuck looked at the floor. He said, "What changed in your read?" Bruce said, "The load is later. When the load gets later, the window I have to read it gets shorter. When the window gets shorter, I have to be closer to find it." Chuck said, "Closer how?" Bruce said, "Attention. Not distance. I have to be paying a different kind of attention. Less broad. More specific." Chuck said, "You had to work harder to read me." Bruce said, "Yes." Chuck stood there. He said, "Good. Just that. Good." The same word he'd used 6 months ago when Bruce told him the first jab had surprised him. Not satisfaction. Not relief. The word a man uses when the data confirms the work. They ran 2 more rounds. Peter said the 4th and 5th rounds were the most technically refined sparring he'd ever witnessed. Not the most exciting, there were no dramatic exchanges, no moments of obvious advantage, no clear winner in any sequence. Just 2 men working at the edge of each other's ability to read. Chuck presenting problems. Bruce solving them. Chuck updating based on the solutions. Bruce updating based on the updates. Peter said, "It looked like mathematics. 2 systems testing each other. Not trying to win. Trying to find the limit." My father asked, "Did they find it?" Peter said, "I don't think there was a limit to find. I think that was the point. As long as both of them kept working, the limit kept moving." My father said, "An infinite problem." Peter said, "Which is the only kind worth having." They stopped after round 5. Bruce and Chuck stood in the center of the floor, both breathing harder than they'd been at the start. Not exhausted, these were 2 men in exceptional condition, and 5 rounds of controlled sparring wasn't going to exhaust either of them. But working. Genuinely working. Bruce said, "The double variable feint. You added a third." Chuck said, "Speed, angle, level." Bruce said, "When did you find the level?" Chuck said, "About a month ago." Bruce said, "It's not quite there yet." Chuck said, "I know. The level change puts my shoulder wrong." Bruce said, "The shoulder is telegraphing it." Chuck said, "I know that too." Bruce said, "Show me." Chuck ran the combination, feint with speed, angle, and level changed simultaneously, the shoulder telegraphing the level changed the way the hip had telegraphed the original combination. Bruce watched. He said, the shoulder drops before the level changes. It's announcing the level. Chuck said, how do I fix it? Bruce said, separate the shoulder from the level change. Let the level change come from the knee, not the shoulder. The shoulder stays still. Chuck looked at him. He said, the level comes from the knee. Bruce said, everything comes from the knee. The shoulder just has to stop pretending it's doing something. Peter said. Two people on the wall laughed at that. Quietly, not at Chuck, but at the sentence. The specific accuracy of it. The shoulder just has to stop pretending it's doing something. Chuck didn't laugh. But his expression changed slightly. The expression of a man who has just been given a sentence that will live in his body for years. He ran the combination again. Tried to change the level from the knee. The shoulder wanted to drop. He held it. The level change was smaller. Less committed. He was managing two things at once, suppressing the shoulder tell while trying to change the level, and neither was clean. Bruce said, that's right. That's the feeling you're looking for. It'll feel wrong for a while. Wrong means the shoulder is learning to be quiet. Chuck nodded. He ran it again. The shoulder dropped. He ran it again. The shoulder held. He ran it again. The shoulder held, but the level change was too small to be functional. Bruce said, that's the problem. You found the shoulder. Now the level is too cautious. Chuck said, I know. He ran it again. The shoulder held and the level changed, but the timing was off. He ran it again. Ray said, no, Peter said. Peter was there, not Ray. Peter said. Chuck ran that combination 40 times in the next 8 minutes. Just the feint. Not the cross, not the full combination. Just the feint, changing the level from the knee, holding the shoulder still. By the 35th repetition, something had shifted. The shoulder was quiet. The level change was functional. The timing was clean. Peter said it happened on the 35th repetition, and he counted because he was watching for it. He said, it just arrived. No ceremony. No moment where you could point to it and say there it is. It was just one repetition, it wasn't there. The next repetition it was. Bruce watched the 35th repetition. He said, that. Chuck stopped. He looked at Bruce. Bruce said, that's the one. Chuck ran it again. The 36th. The same as the 35th. He ran it a third time. A fourth. Bruce said, you have it. Chuck said, for now. Bruce said, for now is enough. The body will forget and remember and forget again. Each time it comes back, it'll be easier to find. Eventually, it'll stop leaving. Chuck held the combination in his hands like a man holding something new and fragile and extremely valuable. He ran it a fifth time. A sixth. Bruce watched. He said, 3 variables. That's close to unreadable. Chuck said, almost. Bruce said, almost. Not quite. Chuck said, what's left? Bruce said, distance. If you can change the initiation distance while holding the other 3. He stopped. He looked at Chuck. He said, that's the 4th variable. 4 changed simultaneously. I don't think I can read 4. Peter said. The room went very still. He said, it wasn't a boast. It wasn't false modesty. It was just an honest assessment. I've been reading your hip for 3 years, and here's the version of your combination that I don't think I can read. Here's the ceiling on my read. My father said. He named his own ceiling. Peter said, yes. My father said, to Chuck. In front of students. Peter said, yes. My father was quiet. Peter said, Chuck's face when he heard that. I've thought about that face for 20 years. My father asked, what did it look like? Peter said, like a man who has spent 6 months climbing a wall and just found out the top of the wall leads somewhere, how they use the space. Chuck's gym after those 2 evenings with Bruce Lee was that kind of room. Peter Jacobs trained there for 3 more years after the second session. He said the combination of what happened over those 2 evenings, the weight shift correction, the feint development, the sparring, the shoulder tell, the 4 variable problem, lived in the room for years. Not as a story. Not as a thing people talked about. As a set of standards. The weight shift was later in that gym than in any other gym Peter had trained in before or since. The attention to the involuntary announcements the body makes before it does something was higher. Students in that gym watched each other's hips and shoulders and knees with a quality of attention that Peter said felt almost clinical. He said, if you'd walked in off the street, you wouldn't have known what you were seeing. It just would have looked like a serious gym with serious students doing serious work. But if you'd trained somewhere else first and then trained there, you'd have felt the difference. The floor had a different standard. Not better technique, necessarily. Better attention. My father asked, is that what Bruce left? Peter thought about it. He said, he left a standard. He walked in and spent 2 evenings raising the ceiling, and the ceiling stayed raised after he left. Because Chuck kept working toward it. And because Chuck kept working toward it, the students kept working toward it. He paused. He said, the thing Bruce gave wasn't the technique. The technique is a set of instructions. The thing Bruce gave was the standard of attention that makes the technique possible. That's the harder thing to give. That's the thing that stays. My father told this to me in pieces. Not all at once, not in one conversation. Over years. The kitchen table version, the car version, conversations I can only half remember now, a fragment here, a detail there, a sentence that surfaced in a different context and only later connected to the larger story. The pieces I'm putting together now are the best reconstruction I can manage. Some of the scenes show. I know that. But the shape is right. I'm sure the shape is right. After Peter Jacobs, my father talked to one more person about that second session. Danny Inosanto. They talked about it twice, my father said, once briefly, in passing, and once at length, at a time and place he didn't specify but that I think was sometime in the early 90s. Danny filled in the detail about the 4th variable, about the afternoon light, about the specific number of senior students on the floor. Danny also told my father something that Peter hadn't mentioned. He said that after the second session, after Bruce had left, Chuck ran the 4 variable feint combination by himself for about 30 minutes. Not drilling it. Not running it at full speed. Standing alone at the wall, working the initiation distance as the 4th variable while holding the other 3, speed, angle, level. Trying to find the version that changed all 4 simultaneously. Danny said Chuck ran it for 30 minutes and didn't find it. He found 3 out of 4, reliably, by the end of 30 minutes. Speed, angle, level, the 3 variable version that Bruce had said was close to unreadable. He could hold those 3. The 4th, the distance variable, kept slipping. Changing the initiation distance while holding the other three was like holding three things in your hands and being asked to add a fourth. The body had a limit on simultaneous management. My father asked Danny, "Did Chuck ever find the four-variable version?" Danny said, "I don't know." My father asked, "Did Bruce ever see it?" Danny said, "I don't think so." I don't think they sparred again after that second session. My father said, "Why not?" Danny said, "Bruce died 8 months later." My father said the room went quiet when Danny said that. Not dramatically quiet. The specific quiet of a sentence that reframes everything before it. 8 months. Chuck working the four-variable combination for 8 months. Bruce not there to read it. The ceiling Bruce had named for himself, "I don't think I can read 4, never tested." My father said, "Do you think Chuck finished it? Found the four-variable version?" Danny was quiet for a moment. He said, "I think it doesn't matter whether he found it. I think the working toward it was the thing." Bruce gave him a problem big enough to spend years on. That's the gift. Not the solution. The problem. My father wrote that down. Not in the notebook, he'd used the notebook for the short version, the 3-line anchor. He wrote this one in a letter he never sent, a habit he had of writing letters when a thought needed more space than a notebook entry but wasn't ready to be said aloud to anyone. I found the letters in the same shoebox. Different paper, different handwriting, looser, more urgent, the handwriting of a man writing faster than he was thinking. The relevant passage. Danny said it doesn't matter whether Chuck found the four-variable version. The working toward it is the gift. Not the solution. The problem big enough to spend years on. I think that's right. I think that's the hardest thing to give someone. Not the answer. The question that is worth your entire life. Bruce gave Chuck that question. He named the ceiling on his own reed to do it. He gave Chuck the one thing Chuck couldn't have built without him. And then he died 8 months later. I don't know what to do with that. The letter ends there. My father never finished it. Here's what I think about when I think about those 2 evenings in Chuck Norris's gym. I think about the weight shift. Not the technique. The principle. The idea that a pattern can be deeply correct, functional, effective, built from years of honest work and still have a ceiling. And that the ceiling is invisible from inside the pattern. And that someone has to be watching from outside, long enough and carefully enough, to see where the hip moves early. And I think about the cost of naming it. Bruce Lee carried the reed on Chuck's 3rd round for 3 years. That red was useful. It was an advantage. It was the difference, in any sparring session, between arriving with information and arriving without it. He named it. He gave it away. Because Chuck asked. Because the question was honest and the man asking it was honest, and the cost of not answering, the cost of carrying the reed while watching the man who didn't know he was being read, was higher than the cost of saying it out loud. And in naming it, he created a new problem. A better problem. A problem that lasted 6 months, and then a year, and then 8 months after the second session ended in a way neither of them could have predicted, and the problem was still there, still unresolved, still waiting, and Chuck Norris was still working on it alone at the wall. My father said once, late, at the kitchen table, the refrigerator cycling on and off in the dark house, he said, "The people who change you don't always know they've changed you. And you don't always know until much later. And sometimes the person is gone before you can tell them." I said, "Are you talking about Bruce Lee?" He said, "I'm talking about everyone. Bruce Lee is an example. There are others. He looked at his tea. He said, "The ones who name the ceiling for you. The ones who say the third round out loud. Those people are rare. And you usually don't understand what they gave you until you've spent years working on the problem they handed you." I said, "Did someone do that for you?" He looked at me. He said, "Your grandfather did. Once. A long time ago." I said, "What did he say?" My father was quiet for a moment. He said, "He told me where my hip was moving early." He looked at his tea. He didn't say what the hip was. I didn't ask. Some things are the right shape without the specifics. Understood. Continuing in English. 14 notebooks. All the same. Black cover, lined pages, the specific weight of a notebook that fits in a coat pocket. My father bought them at a stationery store on the corner of the street where he worked in the 80s. When that store closed, he found another one that sold the same kind. When that one closed, he ordered them by mail. The form mattered. Not because the content depends on the form, but because when the form is the same for 30 years start to look like one long thought. One long attempt to write something down correctly. I found them in the shoebox in his closet. Under the box was a sweater he wore every autumn while I was growing up, dark blue, with one small hole near the left elbow that he never mended. Above the box on the upper shelf was a pair of shoes he wore only to funerals and weddings, in the plastic bag the store gave him when he bought them. He kept the shoes in the bag between uses, which I always thought was either very practical or very sad, and I still haven't decided which. The shoebox was between the sweater and the shoes. I stood in the closet for a long time before I opened it. My mother had asked me to clear the closet. Not immediately, she was practical about these things, which is its own kind of grief, the kind that organizes itself into tasks so it doesn't have to sit still. She gave me 3 weeks before she asked. She said, "Whenever you're ready." Then 3 weeks later she said, "The closet, when you have a chance." I had a chance on a Saturday in November. I drove to the house I grew up in. The house was the same. The driveway was the same, the front door was the same, the specific smell of the hallway was the same, something between wood and old paper and the cleaning product my mother had used on the floors for 40 years. The house was the same and my father was not in it, and those two facts existed simultaneously in a way I hadn't fully processed yet. I went upstairs. I went to the closet. I stood in front of it for a moment. Then I opened it. The shoes. The sweater. The shoebox. I sat down on the floor of the closet. The closet was large enough to sit in, just barely, if you pulled your knees up, and I opened the box. 14 notebooks. Stacked in 2 columns of 7, oldest at the bottom, newest at the top. Newest meaning the one he'd been writing in when he died, which had entries through about 3 weeks before the end. The last entry was about a conversation he'd had with a neighbor about a tree on the property line. 3 sentences. His handwriting was different in those last entries, slower, more deliberate, the handwriting of a man managing something in his hands that had become harder to manage. I didn't read them in order. I picked up the top one first and read the last entry. Then I put it down and picked up a middle one and read it from the beginning. Then I picked up Notebook 7 because I knew about Notebook 7, I knew the Bruce Lee entry was in there, had known about it for years from conversations with my father. He'd told me once, specifically, Notebook 7, the entry between the plumber and the rice recipe. I found it. Ray Harmon, Norris Gym, early 70s. Fast without the feel is just fast wrong. The third round. 3 lines. I'd known the 3 lines were there. I'd heard my father talk about them. But seeing them in his handwriting, in the specific blue ink he always used, in the notebook I was holding in the closet where the shoebox had lived for 30 years. I sat there for a while. The notebooks are not a diary. I want to be clear about that because it changes what they are. A diary is a record of what happened. The notebooks are a record of what mattered. Those are different projects. A diary is chronological, it follows the calendar because the calendar is the organizing principle. The notebooks follow attention. An entry might come 3 weeks after the event it describes, or 3 years, or, in the case of one entry in Notebook 11, 22 years after the fact, a conversation from 1969 that my father apparently needed 22 years to figure out how to write down. The entries range from 2 lines to 2 pages. Most are under 10 lines. My father had an instinct for compression. He believed that if you couldn't say the essential thing in a short space, you hadn't found the essential thing yet, you'd found the surrounding material. The essential thing was smaller. It was always smaller. Some entries name the person. Some don't. Some name the place and date, some give only the year, some give nothing, just the thought, context-free, which means I can read the thought but I don't always know where it came from. There are entries about work. About conversations with colleagues, with people he worked for, with people who worked for him. There are entries about books, not reviews, just specific sentences that landed, the sentence and then a line or two about why it landed. There are entries about my mother. There are entries about me. I didn't read those on the floor of the closet. I'm not sure I've fully read them yet. But here's what I noticed, sitting on the floor of the closet with all 14 notebooks spread around me. The notebooks are a record of the third round. Every entry, without exception, is about a moment when someone named a ceiling. When someone said the thing that was true but hard to say. When someone gave a correction that cost them something to give. When a conversation turned and went somewhere real instead of staying on the surface where it was comfortable. The plumber who'd been a boxer. The rice recipe. The entry about the colleague who told my father once, directly and without cruelty, that his instinct in a specific kind of meeting was wrong and here was why. The entry about his father, my grandfather, which I'll come to. All of it. Every entry. The notebooks are a collection of the moments when someone said, the hip moves early. Here's where. My father spent 30 years writing down every time someone told him the truth. I sat in the closet until the light changed. I don't know how long that was. An hour, maybe 2. The light came through a small window at the top of the closet. He'd had a window cut into the wall above the upper shelf years ago, just big enough to let light in, because he said a closet without light was a place to hide things and a closet with light was a place to keep things, and he wanted a place to keep things. The light moved across the floor while I sat there. I read pieces of things. Not everything. I was nowhere near reading everything. But pieces. Fragments. The shape of 30 years of a man paying attention. And then my mother called me from downstairs. Lunch was ready. Did I want lunch? And I put the notebooks back in the shoebox, 2 columns of 7, oldest at the bottom and newest at the top, and I put the shoebox back on the shelf between the shoes and the sweater. And I went downstairs. And I had lunch. And I didn't say anything about the notebooks. Not because there was nothing to say. Because there was too much, and I hadn't found the shape of it yet, and my mother was eating her soup and looking out the window at the backyard where the tree my father had planted when I was 7 was still standing and still large and still its own self in the November light, and the moment required being present in it rather than in the closet with the notebooks. So I ate my soup. And I was present. And I kept the notebooks inside me the way my father had kept 30 years of conversations inside him, as a weight that was also a resource, something to carry that was also something to draw from. I took the notebooks home 3 weeks later. In the shoebox. I put the shoebox in my own closet, on the shelf, between two things that were already there. And I've been reading them slowly, in no particular order, for the last 2 years. I'm not finished. I don't think I'm supposed to finish. I think the notebooks are the kind of project that takes as long as it takes, and the taking as long as it takes is part of what they are. There is one entry in the notebooks that I keep returning to. Notebook 11. Near the middle. Written based on context, based on other entries around it sometime in the early 2000s. My father was in his late 50s. My grandfather had been dead for about 10 years. The entry is longer than most. About a page and a half in my father's handwriting, which is the equivalent of maybe 400 words. The longest entry in any of the 14 notebooks. It begins. Finally understand what he meant. No name. No date. No context. Just finally understand what he meant. Then the entry. I'm going to read this to you. Not paraphrase, read. My father's words, as close as I can reproduce them. His handwriting was clear, the blue ink has held, the entry is intact. He wrote. Finally understand what he meant. He said it in the car. 1969, driving back from something, I don't remember what, some errand, some trip I was too young to care about. I was maybe 16. He was driving. He didn't look at me when he said it. He said, "You make decisions the way I make decisions." That's not a compliment. I didn't know what to say. I said, "What does that mean?" He said, "It means you decide fast and then you look for reasons the decision was right. You don't look for reasons the decision was wrong. You don't wait to see what you're missing. You decide and then you close." I said, "That's just being decisive." He said, "No. Decisive is deciding with what you have and staying open to new information. What you do, what I do, is decide and then stop taking in new information. Because new information might mean the decision was wrong and we don't like being wrong. We like being decided." I didn't say anything. He said, "Your mother does it differently. She stays open longer." I used to think that was weakness. I think now it's the better version. He didn't say anything else about it. We drove the rest of the way in silence. I thought about it for about a week and then I put it down. I was 16. I had 1,000 reasons to put it down. But it didn't go anywhere. It stayed in there. I'd been watching myself decide for 50 years. He was right. I decide fast and close. I've gotten better at staying open, consciously, deliberately, as a corrective, but the instinct is still to close. The instinct is still to make the decision and then make the decision right. The cost of that is real. I've measured it over 50 years. Some decisions that might have been revisited weren't revisited because I'd closed them. Some information that might have changed things arrived after I'd stopped taking it in. He saw it when I was 16. He said it in the car. He didn't look at me when he said it because he knew if he looked at me I'd defend myself and then we'd be arguing about whether the observation was right rather than whether it was useful. He looked at the road. He handed me the observation the way you hand something fragile to someone, carefully, without eye contact, trusting them to hold it without dropping it. I dropped it for 30 years. And then I picked it up. And I've been working on it since. That's the third round. That's what it feels like from the inside. 40 years of working on a thing your father handed you in a car when you were 16. I wish I could tell him I finally understand what he meant. I wish I could tell him what it cost and what it gave. I wish I could tell him that the hip is later now. Not gone. But later. My father wrote that entry in the early 2000s. My grandfather died in 1992. 10 years between the death and the entry. And 30 years between the car and the entry. The thing my grandfather said in 1969 lived in my father for 30 years before he found the words for it. And then 10 more years passed before he could write it down. And then my father died before I found the notebook. So I found it. And now I'm telling you. This is the thing about the third round. It doesn't happen in real time. The moment someone names the ceiling for you, the moment they say, "Here, this is where your hip moves early, this is the tell you don't know you have," that moment is fast. It happens in a conversation, in a sentence, in a car on the way back from somewhere you don't remember. And then it takes the rest of your life. The receiving of it is quick. The working of it is not. Chuck Norris received the correction in an evening. He worked on it for 6 months and then 8 more months and then, we don't know how long after that. We don't have the end of that story. We have the 6 months and the second sparring session and the 4-variable problem Bruce Lee said he couldn't read, and then Bruce died and the story doesn't end, it just continues without one of its people. My father received his correction in 1969, in a car, from a man who didn't look at him when he said it. He worked on it for the rest of his life. He was still working on it in the early 2000s when he finally wrote it down. He was probably still working on it 3 weeks before the end, when the last entries in Notebook 14 are written in slower, more deliberate handwriting and the last one is about a tree on a property line. I think about what it means to hand someone a question like that. My grandfather was in his 40s when he said it to my father in the car. He said, "You make decisions the way I make decisions." That's not a compliment. He named his own pattern alongside my father's. I do it too. I've watched it for 40 years. I know what it costs. He wasn't teaching from a distance. He was saying, I have this thing. I see it in you. I can't give you the solution because I don't have it. But I can give you the problem. I can name it out loud while we're driving so that you can't unhear it. That's the whole gift. Not the answer. The problem, named out loud, in a car, while looking at the road. And the trust, specific, fragile, easily broken, that the person next to you will carry the problem without dropping it. My father dropped it for 30 years. But he picked it up. And he carried it. And he put it in Notebook 11 in blue ink in the early 2000s and put Notebook 11 in a shoebox and put the shoebox on the shelf in the closet between a pair of funeral shoes and a dark blue sweater with a hole in the left elbow. And I found it on a Saturday in November. And I've been carrying it since. Here is what I've been working on since I read that entry. The same thing. I decide fast and close. I've watched myself do it. The instinct is the same as my father's instinct, the same as my grandfather's instinct, decide and then stop taking in new information because new information might mean the decision was wrong. I notice it now. not always in time to change it. But I notice it. That's the beginning of the work. My grandfather noticed it in his 40s. My father noticed it in his 50s, or rather, acknowledged it in his 50s, having noticed it without acknowledging it since he was 16. I'm noticing it now. I'm hoping that's earlier in the timeline. I'm hoping the noticing earlier means more time to work on it. But maybe that's not how it goes. Maybe it takes as long as it takes regardless of when you start. Maybe the hip takes 40 years to get later and you can't compress the 40 years any more than Chuck Norris could compress the 6 months between Bruce Lee's 2 visits. The work is the work is the work. My father wrote at the end of that entry. I wish I could tell him that the hip is later now. Not gone. But later. I've thought about that sentence more than any other sentence in the 14 notebooks. Not gone. But later. The correction didn't eliminate the pattern. It didn't replace the instinct with a different instinct. It just introduced a delay. A small space between the impulse and the action. A fraction of a second, or in my father's case, maybe a full second, maybe 2, where the new information could still arrive. Not gone. But later. That's the whole work. That's what 30 years of carrying a sentence from a car gets you. A fraction of a second. A small space. A hip that loads later. I called my mother after I read that entry. Not the day I read it, a few days later, after I'd sat with it. I said, "Did Dad ever talk to you about how he made decisions?" She said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Did he ever say anything about deciding too fast? About closing before he had all the information?" She was quiet for a moment. She said, "All the time. His whole life." "Why?" I said, "I found it in the notebook." She said, "Which notebook?" I said, 11. She was quiet for a longer moment. She said, "He wrote that one for a long time. I saw him working on it. I didn't read it, he didn't show me that one. But I saw him working on it at the kitchen table. It took him a long time to get it right." I said, "Did you know what it was about?" She said, "I knew it was about his father. And I knew it was about something his father said to him a very long time ago. And I knew it was one of the ones that mattered most to him." She paused. She said, "He used to say about the notebooks in general, he used to say they were his way of paying a debt he couldn't pay directly. The debt you owe to someone who gave you something important and then died before you could thank them properly." I said, "What do you do with a debt like that?" She said, "You carry it forward. You pass it on. That's all you can do." She said, "That's what you're doing right now, isn't it?" I said, "I think so." She said, "Good." And we talked about other things for a while. The tree in the backyard. The neighbor. The soup she was making for dinner. And when I hung up, I sat in my chair for a long time with the notebook in my hands. Here is what I know about the third round. Not Bruce Lee's third round. Not Chuck Norris's third round. The what I mean when I say it now, after all of this, after the shoebox and the notebooks and the car and my grandfather's voice coming through 40 years of blue ink on lined paper. The third round is the one you don't see coming. The first round is what you know. Your combinations, your timing, your system. The version of yourself you've practiced. You show up to the first round with everything you've prepared, and you run it, and it mostly works, and the things that don't work you already knew about, the small gaps, the known weaknesses, the places where you're slightly slower or slightly less clean than you want to be. The first round is familiar territory. You know the shape of it. The second round is where the other person starts to read you. Not fully, not yet, but the patterns are emerging. They're watching your hip. They've seen the feint twice. The tell is there and they've started to find it, and you can feel them finding it, and so you start to adjust. You run the combination with a slightly different timing. You change the angle. You try to make the tell quieter. The second round is where you find out which parts of your system are actually yours and which parts are just habits you've borrowed and never really tested. The third round is where someone names the ceiling. Not the ceiling on the other person. The ceiling on yourself. The moment someone says out loud, directly, in a car or on a gym floor or across a kitchen table, "Here is the version of you that I can't read yet. Here is the thing you haven't found. Here is the problem big enough to spend years on." That's the third round. And here's what I know about it. You don't get to choose when it happens. My father got his third round in a car in 1969 from a man who didn't look at him when he said it. Chuck Norris got his in a gym in the early 70s from a man who named his own ceiling first. I got mine on a Saturday in November on the floor of a closet, reading a notebook entry written 20 years ago by someone who couldn't have known I'd be sitting there reading it. The third round comes from everywhere. From the living and from the dead. From the people who meant to give it to you and from the people who didn't know they were giving anything. From a sentence in a car and from 3 lines in a notebook between a plumber and a rice recipe and from a page and a half in blue ink that took 30 years to earn and 10 more years to write. It comes when it comes. And what you do with it after that is the whole story. My father carried 14 notebooks. In the last one, the one with the slower handwriting, the one that ends 3 weeks before the end, there is an entry near the middle that I want to read to you. It's not about his father. It's not about Bruce Lee. It's not about any of the people whose names appear in the other entries. It's about a morning. He wrote, "Woke up early. Still dark. Lay there for a while not sleeping, not thinking about anything specific, just present in the dark. There's a quality to early morning darkness that late night darkness doesn't have. Late night darkness is tired. Early morning darkness is waiting. I've been waking up early a lot lately. I don't mind." Lay there and thought about the notebooks. 14 of them now. All the same. All the conversations, all the corrections, all the moments when someone said the thing that was true. I thought, what do I want to happen to them? Not in a morbid way. Just practically. They're a record of something. They should go somewhere. I think they should go to him. I think he'll know what to do with them. I think he already knows some of what's in them, not the specific entries, but the shape of the thinking. The attention to the thing that was true even when it was hard. We've talked around the edges of it his whole life. He's ready for the direct version. I hope he is. I think he is. He wrote that entry, I don't know exactly when. Sometime in the last year. The handwriting is slower, but not the slowest, not the final slowness of the last few entries. Somewhere in the middle of the last year. He didn't tell me the notebooks existed. He didn't say, "There's a shoebox, there's a closet, go find it." He just wrote the entry and put the notebook back in the shoebox and put the shoebox on the shelf. And trusted. The way my grandfather trusted in 1969, looking at the road, not making eye contact, handing the fragile thing over without ceremony. My father trusted that I would find it. And I found it. And I've been working on it since. I want to say something about what it means to be given a question instead of an answer. Because it's harder than it sounds. When someone gives you an answer, you can use it immediately. You can apply it, implement it, check it off, move on. The answer is complete. It fits in your hand. You know what to do with it. When someone gives you a question, a real question, a question that has no answer that arrives quickly, a question that is actually a problem you'll spend years on, the first feeling is not gratitude. The first feeling is loss. The loss of the answer you wanted. The loss of the resolution. The loss of the clean ending where the thing gets fixed and you move on. My father felt it in 1969 when his father said, "You make decisions the way I make decisions." That's not a compliment. He felt it, and then he put the feeling down for 30 years because the feeling was uncomfortable, and he was 16 and there were 1,000 reasons to put it down. I felt it on the floor of the closet. Reading Notebook 11, reading the page and a half in blue ink, reading about the car in 1969 and the man who didn't look at him when he said it, I felt the specific loss of the answer I'd wanted. I'd wanted my father to have solved it. I'd wanted the entry to end with, "And here's what you do, here's the fix, here's the technique that makes the hip move later." It didn't end that way. It ended with, "Not gone, but later." And I wish I could tell him. The question, unfinished. The work, ongoing. The hip not gone but later. And the question passed forward to me. Here's what I've found, carrying it. The question is not a burden. It feels like a burden at first. It has weight. It requires something from you: attention, honesty, the specific discomfort of watching yourself do the thing you know you shouldn't do and not being able to stop it immediately just because you've named it. But weight is not the same as burden. Weight is just something real. Something with substance. Something you can feel in your hands. The notebooks have weight. Real, physical weight: 14 notebooks in a shoebox, which is heavier than you'd expect. But they're not a burden. They're a resource. Everything in them is available to me now. All 30 years of my father paying attention to the moments when someone said the true thing, all of that is in the shoebox on my shelf, available, waiting for me to be ready for the next piece of it. And my grandfather's question is in there too. And my father's working of it. And the entry that says I wish I could tell him that the hip is later now. All of it, in the shoebox, in my closet. Wait. Not burden. I've been thinking about Chuck Norris at the wall. After Bruce left. After the second session. Alone in the gym with the 4-variable problem, standing at the wall, running the combination for 30 minutes. Speed. Angle. Level. Distance. 3 of the 4, clean, by the end of 30 minutes. The 4th, the distance variable, slipping. I think about him running it. Trying to hold 4 things simultaneously. The shoulder staying quiet, the level coming from the knee, the angle changing, the initiation distance changing, all of it at once, all of it without telegraph, all of it simultaneous and invisible. And not finding it. Running it for 30 minutes and not finding it. And then going home. And coming back the next day. And running it again. For 8 months, while Bruce Lee was alive. And then after. I don't know if Chuck Norris ever found the 4-variable version. I don't know if the problem Bruce handed him that afternoon, the problem he named by naming his own ceiling, I don't know if it was ever solved. But I know he worked on it. I know it lived in his hands for years. I know that every time he threw that combination in the years after, in sparring, in competition, in the daily practice of a man who has spent his life in a martial art, the problem was in there. The 4 variables. The question that arrived from someone naming their own limit. The question doesn't require an answer to do its work. The work is the working. There is a question I've been building to since the beginning of this. Not the question about Bruce Lee. Not the question about Chuck Norris or my grandfather or the notebooks. Those are all the same question asked in different registers, different rooms, different decades. The question is this. What do you do when you receive the 3rd round? When someone names the ceiling? When the correction arrives from a living person or a dead one, from a conversation or a shoebox, from a car in 1969 or a gym in the early 70s or a floor of a closet on a Saturday in November? When it arrives, what do you do? My father's answer, distilled from 14 notebooks, from 30 years of paying attention to the moments when someone said the true thing. You work on it. That's it. Not, you fix it. Not, you solve it. Not, you arrive at the answer and close the question and move on. You work on it. You carry it forward. You bring it into the daily practice of whatever you're practicing. You watch yourself do the thing, the hip loading early, the closing before the information is in, the shoulder telegraphing the level change, and you watch without flinching, and you try again. You watch the shoulder drop on the 34th repetition. And you run it a 35th time. And something arrives. Not permanently. Not finally. It will leave again. The body forgets and remembers and forgets, and the hip will load early tomorrow, probably, and you'll catch it or you won't, and either way you come back the next day and you watch again. Not gone. But later. That's the work. That's all the work. My father knew Bruce Lee only through other people. He never met him. He never trained with him. He never sat in a room with him. But Bruce Lee changed him. Through Ray Harmon, who told him about the gym. Through Peter Jacobs, who counted the repetitions. Through Danny Inosanto, who said the working toward it is the gift. Through a 3-line entry in Notebook 7 between a plumber and a rice recipe. Through the idea, which my father carried for 40 years and which I'm carrying now, that the best thing you can give someone is not the answer. It's the problem. The right problem, at the right moment, named out loud without flinching. The version of you that I can't read yet. Here it is. Work on it. My grandfather gave my father one sentence in a car in 1969. My father worked on that sentence for 30 years before he wrote it down. He worked on it for another 20 years after that. He put it in a shoebox and trusted that it would find its way forward. It found its way forward. I'm working on it now. I decide fast and close. The hip loads early. I know what the tell is. Not gone. But later, working toward later, is the whole project. There's one more thing I want to say. About the 3rd round specifically. About what it requires from the person who names it. Bruce Lee named his own ceiling. He said, I don't think I can read 4. Out loud. To Chuck Norris. In front of students. The man who had read the hip for 3 years, who had read the combination through 2 full sparring sessions, who had moved faster than any correction Chuck could produce, that man sat in the gym in the afternoon light and said, here is the version I can't handle. Here is where I stop. My grandfather named his own pattern alongside my father's. He said, you make decisions the way I make decisions. He didn't say, you have a problem I don't have. He said, I have this too. I've watched it in myself for 40 years. I can't give you the solution. I can give you the problem because I've been carrying it myself, and maybe you'll carry it further than I did. That's the cost of giving the question. You have to name yourself in it. You have to be willing to say, I have this thing. I see it in you. I don't have the answer, but I have the problem, and I trust you enough to hand it over. That's the hardest part. Not the technique. Not the correction. The willingness to say, here is also where I haven't arrived yet. Here is also where my hip loads early. We're both in this. I'm not above it. I'm just further along the same road. My father knew that. It's in the notebooks, in the way he wrote about the people who gave him the corrections. He never wrote about them as people who had the answer. He wrote about them as people who were carrying the same questions and had gotten further with a specific one and were willing to say so. Ray Harmon, who had been knocked down by the boxer with the late hip and spent years thinking about why. Not a teacher handing down knowledge. A man sharing a problem he'd been working on. Peter Jacobs, standing at the wall of Chuck's gym, counting 35 repetitions, watching for the moment something arrived. Not an observer. A man paying the specific quality of attention that comes from having the same questions yourself. My grandfather in the car, eyes on the road, saying, you make decisions the way I make decisions. Not, here's your flaw. Here's ours. Here's what I've been working on and what I'm passing to you. I want to end with this. My father's last complete entry in Notebook 14, the last one before the entries get shorter and slower and finally end with the 3 sentences about the neighbor and the tree, his last complete entry is short. 7 lines. He wrote, the work is not the point. The work is the medium. What moves through the work, attention, honesty, the willingness to name the ceiling, that's the point. You pick up the combination and you run it 35 times and something arrives. You don't make it arrive. You create the conditions and you show up and you run it again. The arriving is not yours. The showing up is. That's it. That's the whole thing. The showing up is yours. The rest arrives when it arrives. My father died on a Tuesday. It was March. Cold morning, clear sky, the specific quality of early spring light that hasn't decided yet whether it's winter or not. I was there. At the end he was quiet. Not unconscious at present, but turned inward, working something that didn't have words anymore. The way a man looks when he's running a combination alone at the wall, not showing it to anyone, just working it in his hands. I sat with him for a long time. I didn't say much. There wasn't much to say that the sitting didn't already say. At one point near the end, I think, though I didn't know it was near the end exactly, I said, the notebooks. I found them. He looked at me. He couldn't say much by then. But he looked at me. And I said, the hip is later. He closed his eyes. His face did the thing my father's face did when something arrived, not the 34th repetition, not the 33rd, not the 35th, the specific repetition when the thing that was supposed to arrive finally arrived. Still. Settled. The face of a man who handed something fragile to someone in a closet on a Saturday in November and trusted them not to drop it. And they hadn't dropped it. I'm still working on it. The deciding fast in closing. The hip loading early. The question my grandfather named in a car in 1969 that has now been carried by 3 people across 60 years without being solved and without needing to be solved. I'm still working on it. I show up. I run it again. I watch for the moment something arrives. That's the one move. That's always been the one move.